Hello, I read an interesting theory about why Windows users don't switch to Linux, and the theory tells that it's because of Ubuntu. So Ubuntu is the most popular Linux distribution, so it's the most well-known, and it's supposedly beginner-friendly, but when people look at Ubuntu or try it, they get such a bad impression that they switch back to Windows. So that's what that theory outlines, and I think it's quite interesting, so we will take a look at it today. Here it's an article on XDA developers, so the headline is Ubuntu is the reason Windows users don't want to switch to Linux. And we can read here, for years Linux fans have predicted the year of the Linux desktop is near, and clearly that hasn't really happened. Yeah, we have been foretelling this for many years, but yeah, it hasn't happened yet. It does seem like things are on an upswing, with millions of users downloading Linux in recent months, and overall usage percentage on Steam reaching a historic high of 3.58% in December. So I didn't know about this, but that's great news that it's like everything that Valve is doing and the whole gaming community, that it's actually noticed in the statistics. So it's not just people telling that, but it's actually showing up now in the numbers. That's fun. As a recent Linux convert myself, I'm very happy to see this evolution, but I can also clearly see why Linux isn't more popular. See, the most popular Linux distro is Ubuntu, and if you ask me, it makes a terrible first impression for Windows users. If Ubuntu was my first experience with Linux, and actually it was, I wouldn't want to stick around for very long either. My first Linux distribution was also Ubuntu, but that was like 20 years ago, and I don't know, 10 years or something ago, or maybe it was a bit more. Then I switched to Fedora, and it was for some of the reasons like he will outline in this article. For me, it was like crash messages popping up, and I didn't really like the movement to snap, and that they, instead of using systemd and Wayland, they made their own alternatives with Upstart and Mir instead. And also during that time when I switched, they were also very focused on the Ubuntu Touch with the Ubuntu phone. But yeah, like nothing of that really panned out as they wanted, and I felt like the desktop was a bit neglected. It felt like in the community that like there is no money in the desktop, it's more servers and phones, so that's where Canonical was putting their effort, and that's when I made a switch to Fedora. Fedora has been working great for me since then, so I haven't had any reason to switch, but I can understand why people would get a bad impression of Ubuntu, although it has improved, I think, during the recent years. But let's continue. Ubuntu looks weird. It's too much all at once. I can understand that a different operating system with a different desktop is going to have a big learning curve. But for me, Ubuntu and its GNOME desktop environment definitely feels like a little too much to have to adjust to as a beginner. When you boot into Ubuntu, you're greeted by a taskbar that oddly resides on the left side of the screen with a menu bar at the top that houses all kinds of elements. Now, from a personal perspective, I have grown to like the top bar as a general concept, though I'm not a fan of the 3-section layout for it and would prefer having most icons in one corner. But for someone who is coming from Windows who is used to the taskbar, the default GNOME UI breaks all the paradigms you're used to, and it makes for an uncomfortable experience. You can customize all of this, but for an operating system to require you to dive into its settings right off the bat to get you an experience that's somewhat familiar is a bit much. I would also add to this that I hate how GNOME doesn't focus a window or launch an app when you click a notification. If I install an app through the software store, I will get a notification saying it's ready to use, and when I click it, nothing happens. The store doesn't open, the app itself doesn't open. It's weird. For me personally, I don't really have any strong opinions about the UI. I used Ubuntu since GNOME 2, and then GNOME 3 came out, and but Ubuntu went their own path with Unity instead. Now, like their Unity look and feel is based on GNOME 3, finally, but for me, I didn't really have any problem, I think, with Unity. So, but for me, since I switched such a long time ago to Linux, I think I'm just used to it by now, that it looks different from Windows and I'm used to it. So yeah, maybe my opinion, it's not what a new person would think. So, but for me, I think it's fine. But personally, I kind of like GNOME 3. I've tried 𝗘𝗺𝗡𝗧𝗔𝗖𝗍 a few times through my years with Linux, and I couldn't get used to all settings everywhere, and it was so much to configure. I think with GNOME, I actually like it that it's more scaled down, but Now, as you can see, I'm obviously not using GNOME. I'm using 𝗬𝗧 instead. I kind of like when it's a tiling window manager and when it's scaled down even more. So for me, 𝗬𝗧 works very well. But previously, I've used GNOME 3 for many, many years, and I think it was a great desktop. So I didn't have any problems with it. But yeah, with Ubuntu, they make some of their own customizations to the look and feel. So maybe it's not for everybody, but I didn't have any issue with it when I used it. But let's continue. Snap packages aren't great. Why go against the grain here? Linux has typically relied on terminal-based package managers for installing apps, and while that works pretty well for the more experienced users, it's not something a lot of Windows users want to get accustomed to. To make app distribution easier across different Linux distros, a relatively recent and growing approach has been to use the flatpak format and the FlatHub repository. Quite a few Linux distros support this already, and if it's not included by default, flatpak is usually fairly easy to add to a system. Ubuntu, however, is not playing ball. Canonical has opted to invest in its own packaging format, Snap, which no other distro is adopting natively. At the same time, Ubuntu does not ship with Flatpak support either, and while it's not a big difference, it's not easiest to add Flatpak support to Ubuntu compared to some other distros either. This already causes something of a divide in the Linux user base, with more fragmentation making it harder for developers to support the platform more broadly. But it doesn't help that Snap packages also have frustrating limitations compared to their counterparts. Don't get me wrong, Flatpak apps can already be a bit more limited than versions of the same apps from a typical package manager, but Snap goes even further. When I tried the Snap version of the Vivaldi browser, for example, I noticed it was the only one that did not support hardware acceleration on my PC. Both Flatpak or simply using a deb file supported this just fine, but with the Snap package, playing a YouTube video in my browser could slow my PC down noticeably. It wasn't a good experience. Yeah, so this was one thing that annoyed me also with the Snap packages. It seems like Canonical is really pushing that, and I think like they package even Firefox as a Snap package, and the problem with that is that it's slower to start and it doesn't like integrate so well with everything. So it has some downsides, and when they like already have a working deb package, but they want to replace it with a Snap package that is worse, just to like push the adoption of Snap, I don't really like that. And this pattern we have seen in the past, like with Ubuntu going with 𝗕r instead of Wayland, and with Upstart instead of systemd, and here they have Snap instead of Flatpak. So maybe this is like the last realm that they have, and yeah, they don't want to lose the grip of this thing that makes them a bit unique. I think they have invested a lot of money into Snap and want this to like succeed and be able to stand out in that way. But I agree with the author that it's a bit sad that they are so pushy about Snap and don't want to adopt Flatpak a bit more broadly. And here it says customization isn't as easy, so GNOME extensions aren't exactly obvious. One of the many reasons a user might want to switch from Windows to Linux is the lack of customization options on Microsoft's platform, at least ones that feel native and properly supported. There are plenty of third-party apps that can customize Windows, but you kind of have to look for them, and you never know if something will break. GNOME and Ubuntu by extension isn't bad in this regard, not by a long shot. GNOME extensions are incredibly powerful and can completely change your desktop with a level of flexibility and relatively ease of use you won't find in many other places. But GNOME extensions are also far from prominent in the GNOME UI until you go looking for them. There's no extension manager installed by default and no indication that extensions even exist. The options offered by GNOME out of the box without doing some of your own research make things a little less flexible than some might prefer. Compare that to something like 𝗘𝗺 or Cinnamon, where just right-clicking the dock gives you options for adding applets or changing the placement of elements without any extra required. It's just a little more straightforward, and it helps those other desktop environments become more obvious upgrades over the rigidity of Windows. So I can kind of understand his point. When I've used GNOME, I also found it weird that you need to install a separate program to be able to install extensions, so it's not that easy to find. And like, I don't know if I found that many great extensions, really. I don't know if it's still a problem, but often with the new versions of GNOME, like the extensions would break. So I don't know what they were doing by breaking the API with every version, but it was a bit annoying to even have extensions since they break so often. So I think I was running it quite vanilla most of the time without so much extensions. But like I said earlier, with the 𝗘𝗺𝗶𝗹, I've tried it, but I didn't really like having so many options. It was just too much for me, so I kind of liked that approach with GNOME, that it's more scaled down. But also with the developers behind GNOME, they can be a very picky or so with what they want you to be able to do. Like for a long time, I think it was something with the shutdown options. Like I think the sleep or hibernate mode were not exposed there, and eventually they added it in as an option instead of just turning off your computer. But you need to hold down the Alt key, I think, to be able to see that option. And eventually, I think they removed that requirement. So then you would see all options with the shutdown, restart, sleep, or hibernate, or those that people expect. But for a long while, they didn't want to add that, even though people were requesting it for years. So they can be quite strict or narrow in their mind with how they want to shape the operating system. New hardware support can be iffy for LTS releases anyway. It's probably a little unfair to hold this against Ubuntu, but I think it bears mention anyway. When you go to download Ubuntu, the recommended option is Ubuntu LTS, a release that is supported for longer without requiring further updates. This can be good, but having this older release also means you get an older kernel, and if you want to install Linux on a new PC, that can be a problem. I have some anecdotal evidence of this being a problem, though not with Ubuntu directly, but rather Linux Mint, which is based on Ubuntu LTS. In one of my first attempts to use Linux, I installed Mint on a laptop with a 12th generation Intel processor, only to find out that it shipped with such an old kernel that my Wi-Fi card wasn't properly supported. I needed a wired connection to access the internet, which allowed me to download and update the kernel separately and fix the issue. Mind you, this was already a couple of years after this laptop had been on the market, so it wasn't the newest piece of gear or anything. Whether this is a problem or not will heavily depend on the hardware you have, but generally the LTS version of Ubuntu ships with a kernel that's a few months old, so brand new PCs may have some incompatible hardware that may have some problems running the OS. I don't know how Ubuntu is doing it, but it seems like they're shipping some old kernel. But with Fedora at least, so Fedora release a new version every 6 months of Fedora, but they update the kernel almost immediately, so you can get new kernel versions. I don't know what current one is, but from 6.13 to 6.14, that can happen within one Fedora version. They are not waiting on the next Fedora to release a new point release of the kernel. So I really like that approach. And I guess it's, at least when I was using Ubuntu, it was possible to get a newer kernel. But this is obviously a big problem if you have installed the Linux Mint, which is based on Ubuntu, and you cannot reach the internet because the kernel is too old. So how do you download that? So that's a quite big problem. So, and I think with the Linux kernel, they are very good at maintaining compatibility. So I never had any issue with updating the kernel. It never breaks. So I don't really see the risk of updating the kernel. So I think it's good if the distros are shipping the latest kernel as possible and not just wait for the sake of waiting. I don't think there is much about stability that can go wrong really with having the latest kernel. And here to finish this article, there are better starter options. While Ubuntu tries hard to be an operating system that's a little more user-friendly, it doesn't do the best job at offering a frictionless transition for Windows users, which doesn't help Linux popularity when you consider Ubuntu is the most widely known Linux distro in the first place. I would say options such as KDE Neon, Linux Mint, or Pop! OS offer a better overall experience for someone making the jump for the first time. As a big fan of KDE's desktop environment, that tends to be my recommendation, but there are other solid options out there. I just think Ubuntu is probably one of the worst places to start. So I don't know if I agree with Ubuntu being the worst option. I think it's doable, but maybe it's not something special. And I think with DHH, it's a well-known developer. He created the Ruby on Rails framework. So 2 years ago or something, he switched to Linux. He was a long-time Mac user and then tried Windows for a year, but then he went to Linux. And he started with Ubuntu and made his own like flavor of Ubuntu. So it was called 𝗬𝗡𝗶𝗹. But like 1 year after that, he switched to Arch Linux and made 𝗬𝗡𝗖𝗓. So here is a post about that. 𝗬𝗡𝗓, so it's based on Arch Linux and it has become widely popular. So a lot of people have installed it. But what I like with the DHH and his philosophy about 𝗬𝗡𝗓, so when he switched to Ubuntu, he made it look and feel like a Mac and Windows, so it would feel familiar to new users. But with 𝗬𝗡𝗓, he had a completely different approach. Like he wanted it to stand out and do things that were not possible with Mac and Windows. So with 𝗬𝗡𝗓, it's using Hyperland instead. So it's a tiling window manager, and it looks and feels and acts very differently than from the window managers people are used to when being on Windows and Mac. So instead of like trying to mimic Mac and Windows, he wanted to create a new and better experience, not just be a like almost good alternative, but making something unique instead. And I think that approach is very good. Another Linux distribution, like what he mentioned in this article, that's Pop! OS. I've heard it mentioned a lot. It seems like many people like it. But there are also other newer distros like 𝗘𝗺𝗶𝗹 I've heard quite a lot about. So it's based on Arch Linux, but it's more like targeted towards gamers. And maybe since like there are so many people now switching to Linux because of gaming, maybe trying something like this that is more targeted towards gamers, maybe that's an easier starting point. So like you can do gaming on Ubuntu, of course, but like with the Ubuntu, if like the kernel is a bit older and they seem to be a bit more focused on snap packages or some other like side quest, but maybe pick something like more from the community where they are like really trying to get the best gaming experience possible. Then like, yeah, maybe something like this could be an alternative. So that was everything from me today. I think it was an interesting theory that it's actually Ubuntu that is holding Linux back. I can a little bit see it, but I'm not sure if I completely buy into that theory, but I think it's an interesting one. And yeah, maybe it would help to have something more user-friendly or a bit more exciting when switching. I don't think Ubuntu is that bad. I think it was a bit worse in the past, like when they had a brown theme in GNOME 2. It didn't look that appealing. I think like the look and feel is better now at least. So, but maybe it would help if they would switch to flatpaks and make it a little bit more compatible with other Linux distros and not stand out that much. But that's everything for me, and I hope you have a great day. Bye bye.